This is my fault. My husband put my affair partner in the hospital. It's been 3 months now, and he's still there. I have to admit, things have gotten pretty complicated because of my actions. Sometimes, we do things thinking it's just harmless, innocent fun, not realizing that the fun we had could become our worst nightmare. I didn't expect it to turn out the way it did. I didn't even get a warning. But either way, it became my biggest regret. To protect everyone's privacy, I'll use fake names. My name is Gina Carson, 29, and my husband is Jace Jordan, also 29. We met a few years ago at Howard University. At the time, I was a freshman coming from a low-income background. I had earned a scholarship to study business administration and management. I was passionate about learning because I had a dream of one day owning a major investment company. By the grace of God, I almost achieved that dream. Jace was handsome, intelligent, and everything girls called an ideal guy. We became friends quickly, spending time together every day. He even helped me with my studies. I admired his brains, but he was also a distraction. Our friendship lasted 6 months, and over that summer, I returned to my hometown, Fredericksburg, Virginia. Home was depressing, my parents were divorcing, and I didn't want to be there. I missed Jace, even though we talked often. He lived about an hour away, and I hated that we couldn't meet up. I realized I loved him when I got jealous every time he disappeared for hours without contacting me. But I never confessed my feelings, afraid he might reject me or say he had a girlfriend back home. Our relationship grew stronger, and it felt like we were made for each other. Around this time, I'd also become close with my two roommates. They loved to go out and enjoy life, which wasn't really my thing. One day, they convinced me to join them at a nearby club. It was my first time drinking alcohol or going out like that, and I enjoyed it. We had cocktails, shots, and danced until we were exhausted. I left my phone at home, so I couldn't contact Jace. The next day, he showed up furious, upset that I went out without telling him. He demanded I stop associating with my roommates, which I didn't understand. Despite our ups and downs, we loved each other deeply. Jace eventually convinced me to move into his apartment, citing safety as the reason, though I suspected he didn't want me living with my outgoing roommates. Our relationship had its challenges. Jace was training to become the CEO of his father's company, and his time was split between work and endless business trips. I felt neglected and lonely, but I held on, believing love was enough. As time passed, I started a job at an investment company. Jace's absence during my achievements hurt, but my friends celebrated with me. I found myself going out more often, learning to enjoy socializing and alcohol. Jace and I drifted further apart, and his efforts to mend our relationship were inconsistent. One night, while Jace was on yet another trip, I attended a friend's birthday party at a club. It was a blast. A group of guys joined the party, and we eventually moved to a hotel to continue the celebration. There, I noticed a familiar face, one of Jace's friends. Even though I was intoxicated, I couldn't have mistaken him. The party went on till the next day. Everyone was out of it, but something happened that night, and I don't remember any of it because I was completely blacked out. The following morning, I woke up, hoping to find my friends so we could all go home together. To my surprise, I woke up with two strangers in bed. The worst part? They were both completely naked. I panicked, thinking I had been molested. But when I checked myself, it was clear nothing had been done to me. Wasting no time, I gathered my belongings and ordered a cab home since we had left our cars at the club and rode there in one of the guys' cars. I tried calling my friends, but none of them answered. I was desperate for answers about what had happened that night. My mind was blank, and I was stressed out with a horrible hangover. When I got home, I found Jace back from his business trip. I had thought he would be gone for a week, but whatever he went to do must not have taken long. A week later, I received a friend request on Facebook from someone named Edward Watkins. I accepted, and to my surprise, he was one of the guys from the party. He sent me a message, but I didn't read it until about a week later, as I don't check my Facebook inbox often. When I finally looked at his profile, I was struck by how handsome he was. I replied to his message, and we started chatting. Soon, he asked me to go out with him. At first, I wasn't sure if it was appropriate to meet a stranger, so I declined. But after another week of persistence, I finally agreed on the condition that I would choose the restaurant. When we met, I was taken aback by how much more handsome he was in person. He was down to earth, talkative, and funny, reminding me of how Jace used to be when we first met. We clicked instantly, as if we had known each other for years. As time passed, Edward and I grew too close. Some people would have thought we were dating. I spent most of my time with him doing adventurous activities. I was trying to fill the emptiness Jace's absence created in my life. I missed my husband dearly. Even our intimate moments had lost their spark. There were moments when I felt the urge to kiss Edward, but I reminded myself I was a married woman and needed to respect my vows. Meanwhile, Jace was always tired when he came home. I would wear lingerie to reignite the spark in our relationship, but my efforts were in vain. He would just eat, shower, and fall asleep. Conversations were brief, and even during our intimate moments, he couldn't last long enough for me to reach my climax. Eventually, I gave in. Edward and I crossed a line that should never have been crossed. What started as stolen kisses turned into stolen nights. I convinced myself that Jace would never find out and that I deserved happiness, even if it came from someone else. Edward was everything Jace wasn't anymore: attentive, present, and full of life. But guilt eats away at you. It doesn't let you breathe. Every time Jace looked at me with those tired eyes, I felt like the worst person alive. Yet, I couldn't stop. The thrill of secrecy, the excitement of being desired again, kept pulling me back to Edward. Things came crashing down one fateful evening. Jace had returned from a trip early, and I wasn't home. He called me repeatedly, but I didn't answer because I was with Edward. When I finally got home, Jace was waiting for me, his face a mixture of confusion and anger. "Where were you?" he demanded. I mumbled an excuse about being out with friends, but he didn't believe me. He had seen my messages with Edward. I tried to explain, but he was livid. The confrontation escalated, and before I knew it, he stormed out of the house. My heart sank. I knew where he was going. Jace found Edward that night. I don't know what words were exchanged, but it ended in violence. Jace's rage was uncontrollable, and Edward ended up in the hospital with severe injuries. When Jace came home, his hands were bruised, and his shirt was stained with blood. He looked at me with tears in his eyes and said, "Why?" That single word shattered me. I had no answer. Everything spiraled after that night. Edward was hospitalized, and Jace's guilt over what he had done consumed him. He couldn't look at me without pain in his eyes, and I couldn't look at myself in the mirror without feeling disgusted. It's been 3 months since that night. Edward is still in the hospital, and Jace and I are barely speaking. I don't know if our marriage can survive this. I've tried to apologize, to make amends, but how do you fix something so broken? This is my fault. I set this chain of events into motion, and now I'm living in the wreckage of my choices. Sometimes, I wonder if we can ever move past this, or if some mistakes are too big to forgive. It was frustrating. Jace had introduced me to intimacy and all the pleasures of it, but now he wasn't there to fulfill those needs. I didn't want to betray my marriage, but my desires and loneliness were overwhelming. Edward, on the other hand, made me feel alive. He understood me in a way Jace no longer did. One night, Edward invited me to a party, and I agreed. It was one of his cousin's graduation parties. That night, I drank heavily, trying to forget the emptiness in my marriage. I found myself kissing Edward. His lips were soft and tender, though his kissing technique left much to be desired. However, he made up for it with the way he explored my body. For the first time in what felt like forever, I felt desired. I knew it was wrong, but I couldn't help it. Edward and I began an affair. I didn't know if it was purely physical or if love was involved, but I was falling for him. He gave me attention, understanding, and passion, everything Jace had stopped giving me. 2 months later, I found out I was pregnant. The joy of finally conceiving a child was overshadowed by the uncertainty of who the father was. Was it Jace's or Edward's? My guilt was eating me alive. I decided to break things off with Edward, hoping to salvage my marriage. Jace was ecstatic when I told him about the pregnancy, and he became the supportive, loving husband I remembered. Yet, my guilt lingered, especially when he would touch my growing belly or make love to me. One day, at 7 months pregnant, I started experiencing severe abdominal cramps. Jace was at work in an important meeting, and I didn't want to disturb him. Panicked and alone, I called Edward. He was the only person I felt I could turn to. Moments later, my water broke and everything spiraled out of control. I was in pain for nearly 4 hours before the ambulance arrived. Luckily, it showed up at the same time as Edward, which I was incredibly grateful for. I had sent a text and left a voicemail for my husband, explaining what was happening since he wasn't answering his phone. It hurt me deeply that he didn't respond to my emergency calls. I knew very well that even the most important meetings, like presidential ones, don't last for 4 hours straight. When we got to the hospital, I was rushed to intensive emergency care since it was still too early to give birth. I don't remember what happened after being admitted or diagnosed. I blacked out. When I woke up the next day, I instinctively felt my stomach, which seemed flatter than the previous night. I panicked, fearing I had lost my baby. When I opened my eyes, the first person I saw was my husband. I was angry, furious, actually, because I had almost died trying to contact him, and he hadn't answered. He brought a bouquet, And as much as I appreciated the gesture, my focus was entirely on my baby. I needed to know what had happened to my child. My aunt walked in, and I immediately asked her where my baby was. I didn't even want to talk to my husband at that moment. My aunt explained that my baby was in the neonatal intensive care unit, NICU, because he was born prematurely. While I was still trying to process this, the doctor came in and told me that my baby's condition was critical. His lungs and heart weren't fully developed, so he needed support in the NICU. But the doctor assured me my baby was alive, and those words brought me an immense sense of relief. My husband was overjoyed to hear the doctor reveal that the baby was a boy, since we had decided not to find out the gender beforehand. Despite the challenges, I felt thankful that my baby was alive. He was my miracle, my little fighter. 2 months later, our baby was discharged from the NICU. Holding him in my arms for the first time was the happiest moment of my life. My husband was ecstatic and couldn't take his eyes off our son. At that point, I had forgiven him for not answering my calls. I chose to focus on the blessings of having both my baby and me alive. However, about a year and a half later, Jace started to change again. He stopped giving me time and attention, and I feared he might be cheating or had found someone else. I pushed these thoughts aside, convincing myself that he still loved me. But things only got worse. Jace became distant and uninterested in our family. Our child, who was very attached to him, often asked when his dad would come home or call. Jace would sometimes hang up mid-conversation when our son was speaking to him. It broke my heart to see my child so confused and upset. One evening, I came home from work to find Jace visibly angry. As soon as I stepped in, he threw his phone at me. Confused and scared, I knew something was terribly wrong. He accused me of embarrassing him, but I had no idea what he was talking about. When I checked his phone, I saw a video of me dancing provocatively at a party from nearly 2 years ago. To make matters worse, there were photos of me holding hands with Edward, as well as side-by-side pictures of Edward and my son. It was undeniable our son looked just like Edward. Jace realized the truth, and the pain in his eyes was unbearable. He said I would regret everything I had done, and that I'd reap what I'd sown. He was livid, choking me in a fit of rage before storming out. Days later, I received a call from the hospital informing me that Edward had been brutally attacked and was asking for me. As I prepared to leave, Jace arrived, preventing me from going. Months passed, and Edward remained in the hospital while Jace controlled my every move. Eventually, Jace served me with divorce papers, but not before destroying my life. I lost my job due to false accusations of fraud and corruption. Social services took my son away, citing the viral video as evidence that I was unfit to be a mother. Jace had orchestrated my downfall, and I felt utterly broken. Now I'm torn between guilt and desperation. I need to see Edward and find a way to regain custody of my child. But Jace is watching my every move, and I don't know how to escape this nightmare. Please share your opinions and advice. I don't know what to do.